It is a heavy, quiet tragedy that compromises the adult potential of millions of highly intelligent individuals. You are trapped in a career that actively drains your energy, a lifestyle that offers zero fulfillment, or an environment that feels profoundly hollow. Your logical mind is fully aware of your unhappiness, and you possess the concrete skills required to change your circumstances. Yet, year after year, you remain completely frozen in place, executing the exact same unrewarding routines. The literal second you contemplate making a radical change, such as quitting your job, relocating to a new city, or leaving a dead relationship, an overwhelming wave of paralyzing anxiety, phantom dread, and mental fatigue floods your chest. Your brain instantly invents catastrophic scenarios of failure and ruin, forcing you to retreat back into the safety of your unfulfilling routine. Most people evaluate this painful paralysis and assume it is a sign of personal laziness, cowardice, or a total lack of ambition. They judge themselves harshly, assuming their willpower is broken. But the reality behind this exhausting stagnation has nothing to do with your courage or your worth. What you are experiencing is an acute, predictable biological survival mechanism known as the status quo bias. Your mind is not failing. Your ancient threat detection circuitry is simply treating an unhappy, familiar reality as infinitely safer than the biological terror of the unknown. To understand why you choose comfortable misery over potential happiness, we must look past your willpower and dissect the evolutionary architecture of risk calculation. To decipher the mechanical origin of this adult paralysis, we must isolate the precise neurological networks that calculate risk and reward inside your skull. This process is heavily governed by an asymmetry between the amygdala, which detects danger, and the striatum, which tracks potential gains. When you contemplate staying in an unhappy but familiar situation, your brain processes the decision with absolute neural ease. The situation is a known variable. Your brain already possesses established high-velocity neural pathways to manage the daily stress of that environment. Because there are no surprises, your threat detection circuitry remains completely quiet, allowing your body to maintain a low-energy chemical baseline. However, the exact millisecond you contemplate stepping into a completely new life path, your prefrontal cortex is forced to process an overwhelming volume of unpredictable variables. The brain cannot find a historical data file to predict the outcome. It experiences a state of cognitive entropy. The amygdala interprets this sudden lack of predictability not as an exciting opportunity, but as an active, life-threatening emergency. It fires an immediate distress signal, flooding your system with cortisol to force you away from the edge of change, proving that your brain would structurally prefer a predictable, miserable reality over an unpredictable, happy fiction. This biological resistance to change is deeply anchored in an unyielding evolutionary mandate to conserve metabolic energy. As we have established across this archive, the human brain is a massive energy drain, consuming over 20% of your body's total glucose while accounting for only 2% of your physical weight. Because your ancestors lived in primitive wild environments characterized by chronic resource scarcity and the constant threat of starvation, the brain evolved as a strict conservation engine. It operates on the law of least effort. Routine is incredibly cheap to run. When you execute an automated habit, even a habit that makes you miserable, your brain can rely on the basal ganglia to run the actions on autopilot, consuming almost zero metabolic energy. Conversely, stepping into the unknown forces your prefrontal cortex to work at maximum capacity, building new neural pathways, making constant high-stakes decisions, and hyper-monitoring your environment for threats. This requires a massive expenditure of cellular energy and glucose. To prevent this metabolic drain, your brainstem deploys neurochemical dampeners, generating intense feelings of physical lethargy, mental fog, and resistance the moment you try to change your life. Your brain is not trying to make you unhappy, it is simply trying to keep its energy budget in the black. The psychological architecture of comfortable misery is further reinforced by a profound mathematical asymmetry in how the human mind evaluates gains and losses. This phenomenon is known to cognitive psychologists as prospect theory, and it is heavily anchored in the functional wiring of your prefrontal cortex and insular networks. Neurological tracking studies confirm that the human brain does not weigh positive and negative outcomes on an equal scale. The neural pain response triggered by a perceived loss is structurally twice as intense as the neural pleasure response triggered by an equivalent gain. In simple terms, your brain is twice as motivated to avoid losing what it already has than it is to gain something better. When you evaluate leaving an unfulfilling job or environment, your brain runs a deeply rigged calculation. It takes the concrete, certain benefits of your current misery, such as a predictable paycheck or a familiar neighborhood, and multiplies their psychological value by 2. At the same time, it takes the potential, uncertain gains of a new life, such as creative freedom or true fulfillment, and discounts their value due to the presence of risk. The math of your mind ensures that the pain of change always outvotes the pleasure of growth, trapping your consciousness inside an unfulfilling prison of your own mathematical making. The transition from a passing career rut into a permanent state of comfortable misery is also driven by a physical chemical addiction to your current stress baseline. When you live inside an unfulfilling high-stress routine for months or years, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, maintains a constant low-grade release of cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream. Your tissues become completely saturated with these survival chemicals. Over time, your central nervous system adapts to this toxic environment, treating an elevated level of internal friction as your normal physiological baseline. This creates a severe homeostatic trap. When you finally secure a moment of true peace, silence, or vacation time, your cortisol levels drop sharply. Instead of feeling relaxed, your hyperadapted nervous system interprets this sudden drop in stress chemicals as an unnatural anomaly. It experiences a state of chemical withdrawal. The brainstem interprets the sudden lack of adrenaline as a signal of internal instability, instantly generating an unprovoked wave of restlessness and dread to force your body to seek out friction again. You return to your miserable routine because your body has literally learned to equate a chronic stress chemical baseline with safety, turning your physical flesh into the ultimate warden of your life prison. To fully comprehend the durability of this psychological trap, we must evaluate how comfortable misery completely hijacks your brain's selective attention filters via the reticular activating system, or the RAS. The RAS acts as the primary gatekeeper for your consciousness, deciding which environmental details you notice and which are discarded as background noise. When your survival networks are locked into a status quo bias, your RAS takes its filtering instructions directly from your fear of change. It optimizes your attention to track only the hazards, risks, and potential failures associated with a new path. If you contemplate starting a business or changing your career, your RAS actively amplifies every news story about bankruptcy, economic instability, or personal failure, bringing them to the forefront of your awareness. Conversely, when your environment presents you with clear evidence of people successfully changing their lives, your brain categorizes those examples as lucky exceptions, completely filtering them out. Your conscious mind never receives the objective truth of your options. You are locked inside an insulated cognitive filter where your brain actively deletes all evidence of your potential success, while hyper-focusing on every possible danger, ensuring that your current misery remains the only logical choice. While your selective filters are analyzing the environment for danger, your medial prefrontal cortex is running an automated comparison matrix that completely paralyzes your agency. Your brain calculates your capacity for change by running simulations based on social comparison theory. However, this comparison engine operates on a highly asymmetric dataset. You experience your own internal reality from the inside out, meaning you are intimately aware of your internal processing friction, your moments of crippling self-doubt, and the deep fatigue running through your nervous system. In contrast, you only experience the external reality of the people who have successfully changed their lives from the outside in. You only see their confident public presentations, their seamless career transitions, and their final milestones. Your analytical brain automatically compares your raw, chaotic, unedited internal blooper reel with their highly refined external highlight reel. The system detects a massive structural mismatch. It reasons that if they possess an inherent certainty and bravery that you lack, you are uniquely unequipped to survive the wilderness of change. The algorithm of your mind fails to calculate that they were vibrating with the exact same internal terror when they took their leap, transforming a universal processing delay into a personal feeling of incompetence. To understand why the human brain reacts to the concept of change with such an intense, agonizing wave of physical dread, we must leave our modern context and look at the brutal realities of evolutionary history. For over 99% of human history, leaving a familiar territory or breaking away from an established tribal routine carried an immediate statistical death sentence. If a primitive hominid chose to leave the geographical boundaries of their known territory, where they already knew the water sources, the predator routes, and the food supplies, they were stepping into an environment where their survival probability dropped to nearly zero. The unknown was a physical wilderness filled with lethal hazards. Evolution fiercely selected against the nomadic, hyper-adventurous spirits who took unnecessary geographical or social risks. It heavily favored the individuals whose brains developed a profound, instinctual terror of the unfamiliar. The status quo bias was an evolutionary masterpiece of safety. It intentionally built a mechanism where stepping past the boundary of the known triggers a violent amygdala response to force the organism back to the safety of the cave. The suffocating anxiety you feel when trying to change your modern career today is the ancient phantom echo of a primitive hominid who knows that if they walk past that tree line they will be hunted down and killed by the wild. The persistent stagnation of comfortable misery is also heavily driven by a cognitive distortion known to neuroscientists as the sunk cost fallacy, governed by the anterior cingulate cortex. The sunk cost fallacy is the irrational biological compulsion to continue investing metabolic energy, time, and resources into an unfulfilling path simply because you have already invested heavily in that path in the past. Your brain operates as a strict accounting machine that hates registering an internal loss. When you contemplate leaving a career path that required a 4-year degree, a decade of corporate climbing, and immense personal sacrifice, your anterior cingulate cortex treats the act of leaving as an immediate write-off of all that historical energy. The mind interprets changing direction as an admission of personal failure, which triggers an intense wave of neurological pain. To avoid this internal pain, your brain invents the deceptive narrative that you must stay in the miserable job just to justify the energy you already spent. You are trapped in an absurd cognitive loop where you choose to sacrifice your entire future happiness simply to honor a past investment that is already dead, completely unaware that the accounting software of your mind is keeping you broke. The long-term danger of remaining inside this mental prison is the severe accumulation of allostatic load caused by maintaining a constant professional mask. When you stay in a career or environment that violently contradicts your true values and potential, your prefrontal cortex is forced to run a continuous background program dedicated entirely to impression management and self-monitoring. You have to manually force yourself to care about tasks you despise, fake enthusiasm for metrics that feel hollow, and suppress your natural intelligence just to blend into a broken corporate culture. From a neurological perspective, running this artificial persona requires an immense, non-stop expenditure of executive energy. Over years of continuous execution, this chronic energy expenditure completely exhausts your nervous system's buffering capacity. The high allostatic load causes a systemic downregulation of your serotonin and dopamine receptors, plunging your mind into a flat gray state of chronic apathy and clinical burnout. The energy required to keep the engine running becomes so overwhelming that your resilience collapses entirely, proving that the comfortable misery you chose to avoid the short-term risk of change eventually extracts the ultimate long-term tax, the total destruction of your biological vitality. When we look at this entire stagnation process through a cold, clinical lens, we can perform an objective somatic autopsy on our paralysis and completely strip it of its psychological terror. The next time you contemplate a life-changing decision and feel a sudden, suffocating wave of panic and physical fatigue settle into your chest, you must instantly recognize the mechanical order of operations inside your flesh. The racing heart, the tight throat, and the internal voice telling you that you are a failure who cannot survive the transition are not profound emotional truths. They are not an indication that your goals are impossible, that the economy is too unstable, or that you are inherently unequipped for growth. They are simply the physical, predictable consequence of an ancient survival engine that has detected a lack of predictability and has slammed on the emotional alarm to force you back into the energy-efficient safety of your cage. The terrifying thoughts your mind manufactures during this window are completely empty. They are nothing more than a desperate fictional script written by an overtaxed prefrontal cortex trying to find an explanation for a raw, mismatched chemical surge in your kidneys. The thoughts are not insights. They are simply the neurological exhaust produced by a primitive brainstem that is terrified of the wild. Breaking the cycle of comfortable misery requires you to completely change how you respond to the 12-millisecond logic gap. You cannot stop your primitive amygdala from treating the unknown as an immediate survival threat. Your brain is structurally wired to prioritize predictability over happiness. Your objective is not to wait for the fear to magically disappear before you change your life, but to change your relationship to the fear. When the wave of transition panic hits your chest, you must expect the biological delay. Instead of engaging with the catastrophic scenarios your mind creates, your only goal is to look at the tension objectively, accept the unspent adrenaline, and say to yourself, "This is not a life crisis. This is just my brainstem reacting to a lack of data." By removing the moral shame and the mental narrative from the sensation, you give your prefrontal cortex the time it needs to update its risk profiles, map out its new parameters, and naturally step into the wilderness of true, unpolluted growth. Thank you for watching this explanation. If you want to understand more about the silent biological mechanics that dictate our daily human struggles, consider subscribing to the channel. This library is a growing archive dedicated strictly to the deep science of why the mind and body operate this way. No trends, no shortcuts, just the objective truth of our shared biology. Explore the rest of the archive to understand your mind, and I will see you in the next breakdown.